Ryan and Steve are 32. They earn the same salary, live in the same city, and have both managed to save $80,000. But they make one very different decision. Ryan buys a home. Steve keeps renting and invests his money instead. 20 years later, one of them has significantly more wealth. But the answer isn't as simple as buying is better or renting is better. Let's follow the math. Ryan finds a $350,000 home. He puts 20% down, that's $70,000, and spends another $10,000 on closing costs. So his entire $80,000 goes into the house. He takes a $280,000 30-year mortgage at 7%. His mortgage payment for principal and interest is about $1,863 a month. But that's not the real cost of owning. Add roughly $300 for property tax, $130 for insurance, and about $290 for maintenance. Now Ryan's real monthly housing cost is around $2,580. And notice something important. Only part of that $2,580 is actually building his wealth. A large portion is simply the cost of having a place to live. Steve finds a similar place for $1,900 a month. So initially, he's spending about $680 less every month. But here's the important part. Steve doesn't spend that $680 on restaurants, vacations, or a nicer car. He invests it. And he also invests the $80,000 he didn't use as a down payment. That means Steve starts with something Ryan doesn't have, a large amount of money already working in the market. Now the comparison becomes interesting. Ryan owns a house, Steve owns a portfolio, and both investments are growing, but they're growing in completely different ways. Ryan gets leverage, Steve gets compounding, and over 20 years, those two forces are going to fight it out. Let's jump forward 10 years. If the house appreciates by 3% a year, Ryan's $350,000 home is now worth roughly $470,000. His mortgage balance has fallen to about $240,000. So his home equity is roughly $470,000 minus $240,000, which equals $230,000. That's real wealth. But remember, Ryan didn't simply put $80,000 into an asset and watch it become $230,000. He also made mortgage payments for 10 years. He paid taxes, he paid insurance, and some years something in the house inevitably broke. That matters when comparing the two strategies. Now look at Steve. Let's assume his investments earn an average 8% per year, including reinvested dividends. And because rent keeps increasing, his original $680 monthly advantage doesn't stay $680 forever. So rather than pretending he invests the same amount forever, we'll use a conservative, simplified assumption that he invests the difference whenever renting is cheaper. After 10 years, that gives Steve a portfolio of roughly $275,000. So at year 10, Steve is slightly ahead financially. But Ryan owns a home worth almost $500,000, while Steve has something Ryan doesn't have: liquidity. If Steve needs $20,000, he can sell part of his portfolio. Ryan can't exactly sell the kitchen. But there's another side to that. Steve can access his money easily. Ryan has a huge amount of wealth sitting inside his house. But home equity isn't sitting in a bank account waiting to be spent. To access it, Ryan usually needs to sell, refinance, or borrow against the property. So one has more flexibility. The other has more control over a physical asset. Neither is automatically better. Now let's go another 10 years. By year 20, Ryan's mortgage is much smaller. Assuming the house continues appreciating at 3% a year, that $350,000 home is now worth around $632,000. His remaining mortgage is about $160,000. So $632,000 minus $160,000 equals about $472,000 in home equity. That's a very respectable result. And remember, Ryan is now getting much closer to owning the home outright. But Steve's investments have had 20 years to compound. Using the same 8% return with his original $80,000 plus the monthly savings he was actually able to invest along the way, his portfolio grows to roughly $630,000. So after 20 years, Ryan has about $472,000 in home equity, while Steve has about $630,000 in investments. At first glance, Steve wins, but there's a catch. Before we move further, I want to ask you for a small favor. If you're finding value in these videos, consider subscribing to The Casual CEO. My mission is simple: to make money, investing, and wealth building easy to understand through practical, research-backed content without the fake guru nonsense. Every video takes hours of research, writing, and editing, and your support helps me keep creating content like this. And before we continue, I'd love to hear from you. Comment below with your biggest takeaway or your opinion on today's topic. I read every comment, and many of my future videos are inspired by your ideas. Now let's get back to the video. Ryan's $472,000 is not the same as having $472,000 in cash. If he sells the house, he has selling costs. And he also spent 20 years paying property taxes, insurance, maintenance, and repairs. Steve, meanwhile, paid rent for 20 years. So neither side gets a free ride. And there's another enormous difference. Ryan's mortgage eventually ends. Steve's rent doesn't. That changes the picture dramatically. Imagine Ryan reaches the end of his mortgage. One of his biggest monthly expenses disappears. Steve doesn't get that moment. His landlord doesn't eventually say, "You've rented for 30 years, so congratulations. The house is yours." He keeps paying. That's why the decision becomes much more interesting over 30 years. At 30 years, Ryan's mortgage is completely paid off. If the home continues appreciating at 3% annually, that original $350,000 house would be worth roughly $850,000. Ryan now owns it outright. Steve's portfolio has had another decade to compound, but he also continues paying rent. And this is where the decision gets uncomfortable, because a spreadsheet can make either choice look like the obvious winner depending on the assumptions you put into it. Change the stock return from 8% to 6%, change house appreciation from 3% to 4%, increase rent faster, add a major repair, change mortgage rates. Suddenly the winner can change. That's why copying someone else's rent versus buy calculation can be dangerous. Your city isn't their city, your mortgage rate isn't their mortgage rate, and your behavior isn't theirs. And this is where most rent versus buy arguments go wrong. They compare rent with the mortgage payment. That's not a fair comparison. A homeowner doesn't just pay a mortgage. They pay interest, taxes, insurance, maintenance, repairs, and eventually selling costs. But a renter doesn't automatically win either, because renting only gives you a financial advantage if you actually invest the money you save. If Steve saves $680 a month on housing but spends it on a car, vacations, and takeout, the spreadsheet completely falls apart. He doesn't get the investment portfolio. He just gets the rent bill. And that might be the biggest lesson in this entire comparison. The strategy only works if your behavior supports it. Renting gives Steve the opportunity to invest. It doesn't force him to invest. Buying gives Ryan a mortgage, and that mortgage forces him to make a payment every month, whether the market is up, down, or completely terrifying. In a strange way, the mortgage becomes a form of forced saving. And there's one more simple calculation you can use before making this decision. It's called the price-to-rent ratio. Take the home price and divide it by the annual rent. In our example, $350,000 home divided by $22,800 annual rent equals about 15. A ratio around 15 makes buying much more interesting. But if that same house cost $600,000 while comparable rent was still $1,900 a month, the calculation would look very different. The house would be extremely expensive relative to the rent, and renting could become much more attractive. So before asking, should I buy? Ask a better question. What does this house cost compared with what I could rent for? That one question can completely change the decision. So which one actually makes you richer? There isn't one universal answer. Buying makes more sense when you're going to stay for a long time. The price is reasonable, and you value stability. Renting can make more sense when homes are extremely expensive relative to rent. You value flexibility, or you can consistently invest the difference. Ryan's advantage is leverage, stability, and eventually owning his home outright. Steve's advantage is liquidity, diversification, and compound growth. And here's the real lesson. The biggest mistake isn't choosing rent, and it isn't choosing a mortgage. The biggest mistake is making the decision without doing the math. Because 20 years from now, the question won't be, did I rent or buy? It will be, what did I do with the money I had? A $680 monthly difference can look insignificant today. But give that money 20 years of consistent investing, and it can become a serious amount of wealth, and give a mortgage 30 years of payments, and you can eventually own a valuable asset outright. Time turns small decisions into very large outcomes. If you enjoyed this breakdown, subscribe for more simple real-world money math, and comment below, would you rather own the house or own the portfolio?